This is a critical moment in India's history. It now has the world's largest population and one of the youngest. Its fast-growing economy has vast potential. The challenge now is to seize the moment. In the mid-1980s, India was a top 10 global economy, but it tumbled out of that list for more than 2 decades as several countries powered ahead of it, particularly China. But India has been growing fast. As of 2022, it ranked in the top 5 for the first time ever. It is widely projected that it will be behind only China and the USA by 2030.
It is truly a sweet spot, so to say, right now for India.
The broad story of Indian growth, development, poverty is one of improvements, sustained improvements over time, and in fact improvements that have accelerated in the last 15 years or so.
Added to its growing economic importance, India is becoming more prominent on the world stage as the changing global order gives it ever more geopolitical significance.
2 great nations and 2 great powers. Cheers.
But there are huge question marks over whether India will take its chance.
The real problem with India is that India's human capital, whether it is in terms of education, whether it is in terms of public health, whether it is in terms of training, whether it is in terms of participation of women in the labor force, that is extremely poor.
Admission that there aren't enough jobs, you don't see that kind of admission, or you don't see that attention being paid to unemployment as a problem.
It's hard for me to overstate how severe the environmental damage ongoing in India is.
Will this be the Indian century? Or could India squander the chance to become a true global economic powerhouse? We'll take a closer look in this episode of Business Beyond. One of the main reasons for optimism about the Indian economy is its strong GDP growth rates relative to other large economies. In 2022, the global economy grew by just over 3%. The USA and China grew at roughly the same rate, while the EU 27 did slightly better. But India outstripped them all, achieving GDP growth of 7% last year, by far the biggest figure among the world's 10 largest economies. And India has another growing advantage over those countries, a vast youth population. As other industrialized nations deal with the challenge of an aging population, India has a unique demographic dividend. India has overtaken China as the world's most populous country. It now has a population of 1.425 billion. That is projected to rise to 1.7 billion by 2060, by which time it is expected to have close to 500 million more people than China. And perhaps the biggest demographic dividend India has to play with is the youth of its population. More than half are under 30.
I think it can be in a very strong and positive place. I think it has the prerequisites that could put it in that place. Most of all, the very large reservoir of labor that it possesses, a young population, a large, capable, fairly well-educated population. So I think that these things are in favor of India becoming this powerhouse.
Strong economic growth in India is not a new phenomenon, but many experts believe the country is better placed than it was before to capitalize.
The rate of growth that we see today is actually lower than the rate of growth that we saw in the 2000s, for example. After the 1991 liberalization, that's when really the rate of growth picked up. And we had several years of growing at 8% or more.
India is growing very well. A lot of the internal issues that had been there have been sort of cleaned up. A lot of reforms have happened, but also balance sheets of the banks and the companies which had been in some trouble have all been cleaned up now. So in some sense, India now stands in a situation which is even better than what it was in 2003, when, the first wave of this very rapid growth began.
India has not been shy about talking up its growing economic prowess. That was clear when the country's Prime Minister Narendra Modi visited the US last month for a pageantry-filled 4-day state visit.
Mr. Speaker, when I first visited the US as a Prime Minister, India was the 10th largest economy in the world. 10th. Today, India is the fifth largest economy. And India will be the third largest economy soon.
One area Modi's government has focused on is urban infrastructure, such as roads, motorways and bridges. This year, the government plans to plough a record $122 billion into capital expenditure.
That is an area of great improvement. This is infrastructure across transport infrastructure as well as communications infrastructure. Additionally, amenities at the household level. So just basic things, including access to toilets, to drinking water, to clean cooking fuel, to electrification. All of that has increased substantially.
The World Bank estimates that India needs to spend at least $840 billion on urban infrastructure over the next 15 years if it's to meet the needs of its population. But could India seriously rival long-established economic powers like the USA and China? It certainly lags behind both in one key area: exports. China's modern economic miracle can largely be explained by its remarkable manufacturing and export prowess. It's the biggest exporter in the world, ahead of the USA and Germany. You have to go a long way down the list before you get to India. The world's most populous nation is only its 18th biggest exporter. Many point out that comparisons with China and the USA are simply unrealistic.
We should recognize that the gap between India and China is really massive. The Chinese economy is 6 times India's size. Chinese per capita income is $12,000 per capita. India's per capita income is $2,000 per capita. China provides more than 15 to 18% of global trade. India provides 2% of global trade. So, and the gap between India and China, even when China is slowing down and India is going faster, has only increased in the last decade or so.
China clearly has been a manufacturing machine and very, very successful. I think India is a little different than there. India is not a manufacturing machine. It has not been terribly successful. It has had some successes, in some areas, but its past has stayed a lot longer with India than it did with China.
So if manufacturing is not a strength, what makes the Indian economy tick? Agriculture is the main source of work in India. More than 2 in 5 are in the sector, according to the International Labour Organization. Services accounts for a third, with around 10% employed in public services. And while India has done well in some sectors, such as textiles and pharmaceuticals, manufacturing overall accounts for less than 12% of the Indian workforce. Let's take a closer look now at that services sector, because one thing within that, which is certainly making India tick, is tech. Indian export growth has been powered recently by its information technology services. It has also developed a reputation for having a vibrant startup culture. In terms of funding, it's now number 2 in the world behind the US. Neha Singh is the CEO of Traction, an Indian firm which tracks companies in the sector.
The IT sector is fairly well poised, which includes large IT companies which are doing a lot of digitalization projects. So people have also realized the importance of digitalization globally. The second is the whole the startup sector. There are various subsectors within that, but that is another thing that continues to grow, and there you see a lot more new areas coming up.
She says India is thriving in the development of digital infrastructure, helping to connect the country's vast population to a variety of services.
So the government has done a lot of things in having this sort of the digital infrastructure, which has boosted some of the other things, like a boosted money transfer, boosted digitalization of cash transfer, which happens. The percentage of transactions, digital transactions, has increased in the economy. Right? It has made that accessible to a lot of people.
India has also become an important destination for some major tech giants. Apple has moved some of its iPhone production to the country, while Google and Amazon recently vowed to heavily step up their activities in India.
Where foreign investment really, particularly direct foreign investment, but even equity is very powerful, is that it knows where the high returns are better than the local capital does. Like if Apple comes in, for example, it brings in with it not only the Apple technology, Apple's management style, it also brings in the way of doing things.
So far, we've focused a lot on the positives, but there's another side to this story. India has come a long way in recent years, but the country still faces a vast array of challenges that need to be confronted. Many of the experts we spoke to say India has a huge problem when it comes to so-called human capital. That's focusing on issues such as education, health, and gender equality in determining overall economic success. In his book, India is Broken, Professor Ashoka Modi from Princeton University says that in the 75 years since Indian independence, successive governments have failed the people.
So the Indian economy fell particularly sharply during COVID. It's bounced back, and people are extrapolating that bounce back as some kind of a new normal, which it is not. Because if you look at the last 4 years, if you average the growth out over the last 4 years, including a year before COVID, India has been growing at about 3.5%, which is nowhere close to the forecast being made.
He says India's problems won't be solved by looking only at GDP figures.
It's in the shadows that the problem is. Poor job creation for 75 years with no prospect of job creation in the coming 20, 30 years. A youthful population emerging into this job scarce environment, poor public goods provision, education, health, cities, the environment, and the judicial system. The judicial system is broken, the environmental damage is rampant.
Let's focus now on one of the areas he mentions there, employment. India's huge youth population need jobs, but there's a big problem. The better educated you are in India, the more likely it is that you will be unemployed. Overall, Indian unemployment stands at around 7%, but for those who've been to third level education and beyond, the unemployment rate is more than double that. Even those with an intermediate or second level education rate struggle to find work more than those with basic or practically no education. Given that more than 40% of Indian employment is in agriculture, many of those with low education levels work in extremely poorly paid jobs. That's obviously a big problem, allied to the fact that there is not enough adequate work for those with high education levels.
But the economy has not been able to produce enough jobs to absorb all of these people. I think what sometimes happens is that there is a very narrow top of the Indian pyramid, and all of the conversation in the Indian media and perhaps even globally circles around this very tiny sliver. So there is sometimes a feeling that there are far more high-skilled jobs than there actually are, while what's happening on the ground is that there just simply aren't enough high-skilled jobs to be able to provide to these young Indians.
Another issue that India must grapple with is the role of women in its labour force. Let's take a selection of countries, major economies like China, the US and the UK, as well as some big developing economies comparable to India such as Vietnam and Indonesia. The gap between the amount of women and men in work in all those countries is vastly smaller than the gap in India. Just over 20% of women in India are officially in the labour force, compared to 70% of men.
Any story of Indian growth and of employment-powered Indian growth should be cannot really function to its full potential if half of the population is not participating in ways that would be expected at these levels of growth and development or that are happening elsewhere in the world. So yes, Indian female labor force participation is among the lowest in the world.
And it's getting worse.
Not only is the level low, what we have observed is in the past few decades that level has actually decreased over time. So if we simply go by the fact that India is developing, women are getting more educated, they have fewer children, we would expect the trend to be in the opposite direction. So we would expect that women should be more likely to participate in the labor market rather than less.
India's unusually low female labour force participation rate is often attributed to specific societal factors.
The gender roles require women to be the primary caregivers within a household. They are supposed to be the primary person responsible for taking care of household chores. And basically, this is what we call the reproductive labor that women provide. So if women are the ones who have to do this, then obviously they will have less time to participate in the labor market.
Ashwini Deshpande has studied India's inequalities for decades. She says that focusing on societal norms does not give the country's government an excuse for inaction. She says simple moves like providing access to cooking gas cylinders would give women more time to participate in the labour force.
I think here the academic community also needs to introspect to say, are we focusing enough on the economic factors that will change women's participation in paid work, or are we exclusively just going inside the household and focusing on some very difficult to change social norms? Then we are stuck for 200 years. Nothing will change.
Inequality is not unique to India. It afflicts the world's richest nations too. But many experts say that India's strong economic indicators mask the depth of its social problems.
We are really talking about a very poor country when you spread it across this thing. The GDP with a massive country like us, the GDP will always be distorted. It will always be bigger. It will always be huge because of the sheer population and the sheer geographical size. The fact is also that India, because there are certain sections of Indian science and technology which did very well. So India can send rockets into space. India can do all these things which a lot of equivalent countries cannot do. India can have an aircraft carrier. India has these IITs, these information technology companies, etc., makes it very attractive. And India is not really at the lowest rung in that sense, but it's not really at that level at which many Western commentators think that India is, or India is about to break through.
Ashoka Modi points to the country's education system as an example of why he believes the country is, in his words, broken.
The psychology has set in, education is important, and eventually we will get to it. But really, is it really that critical?
Data journalist Rukmini S. says there have been improvements in Indian education, particularly around female participation, but that there remains huge inequality.
So it means that a person like me was able to, access uniformly excellent quality of education, which then just continues to give you steps up in life. But what we do know is that from assessments of quality of education across Indian schools, particularly in rural areas, children go right up to class 3, 4, 5, grade 3, 4, 5, without being able to read a single line in any language, not just in English, without being able to do simple calculations, including addition and subtraction. So they are making it to school. Teachers are there in those schools, school structures exist, but the quality of education that they receive in there is extremely patchy and extremely driven and sort of mediated by privilege.
It's not only economic factors which have to work in India's favour in order for it to secure its future. One huge concern is the environment. Indian cities are among the most polluted in the world, a problem which Ashoka Modi says the government is not dealing with. And the scale of environmental damage in India is a serious threat to social and economic progress.
Indian cities traditionally occupy the highest ranks in the world's most polluted cities. Indian cities compete with each other in who is going to, which one of them is going to be more polluted than the other. But the really severe problem is with water. Air can, in some sense, be clean, but the dying rivers, every single river I'm going to assert in India today is dying for various reasons. Overexploitation, dumping of waste, sand mining of river beds. And there is zero interest in that.
Another vital issue which many say Narendra Modi's ruling Hindu Nationalist Party have made worse is the question of democratic decline and the worsening ethnic tensions between Hindus and the country's sizable Muslim minority. Many believe this threatens the Indian Republic itself.
The fact of the matter is that there's been a democratic decline in India. India's democracy is not doing that well. There's been targeting of religious minorities like Christians and Muslims in India under Mr. Modi's Hindu regime. It's a very Hindu nationalist regime. And that makes countries like the United States and Western European countries extremely uncomfortable.
If we neglect these problems for too long, I think social tensions will rise as they have already started to rise. And there is a limit to the divide and rule kind of policy. You can pit one section of the population against the other, and you can say immigrants are responsible for your problems, or, this race is responsible for the problem of the other race, etc., etc. There's a limit to which that blame game can take you just that far and no further.
To say that India finds itself at a decisive moment is an understatement. As we have seen, it undoubtedly has the potential to be a major economic power, rivaled only by the world's richest nations. But can it overcome its problems to achieve this? There's a wide range of views.
The future is very bleak, in my view. We are headed to certainly an environmental crisis. We are headed potentially to a social violence.
I have faith in the Indian people. And I think time and again, India has shown that, yes, there have been dark episodes in our history, as in the history of all countries. But I think time and again, we've shown that, we are more democratic than sometimes, you sort of despair. And so I think I have hope that the democratic, federal, plural, diverse character of India will sustain itself.
But I do think that, economic growth is not going to solve these problems. Some of the, some of the most sort of violent conflagrations that we've seen in India have been in very economically successful regions of the country. So I don't think one means that the other is taken care of. That is an entirely different and essential conversation that needs to happen in India about just seeing fellow Indians as fundamentally equal and fundamentally good.
Will India be in 20 years' time be a power like China? I don't think India will be that kind of power. India is a different kind of power. I mean, if it is a power, it is going to be a very different. The democratic tradition is incredibly strong in India. And therefore, its behavior internationally is going to be very, very different.
It's far too soon to say for sure if this will be the Indian century. Its 1.4 billion people face huge challenges that any society should be deeply concerned by. But for the first time in its history, India has a shot at being one of the most powerful and influential economies on the planet. The world is watching its progress. That's all from this episode of Business Beyond. If you're interested in seeing more from us, check out our playlist and do look out for our new series, Transforming Business, where we take a closer look at the business side of the green transition. Thanks a lot for watching, and until the next time, take care.